Which you'll find as we go through this conversation. Dolores and I have talked in some depth about how we want to do it, that she's going to chime in on a number of key issues where she's had some really practical experience. So with that, let me get right to the bottom of it so we have plenty of time for discussion. As you know, this was a study that we did for the IBM Center for the Business of Government. And before getting into the sort of the 4 key questions we were looking at, let me just stage set for a second. And all of you know this, but I always like to repeat it because I can't stress its importance enough. The reason we're having this conversation is because the government's access to technology is not nearly what it needs to be. Now, for all of the discussions and all the work industry and government have done to try to make sure the government has its access to everything that's available commercially, the reality is that we don't as a government. And the reality is that the technology marketplace is rapidly outpacing what's going on in government. And as I'm fond of saying, we've known for a long time that we're falling behind, but in this day and age, you fall behind further, faster. This is not a new issue. This goes back 30 or more years, 40 or more years. In fact, you can really trace the beginnings of this gap to the 1970s, which was the first time in history that the private sector began to spend more money in R&D than the United States government. And even in the late 90s, we found the top 6 dozen technology companies were spending more in R&D combined than the entire Department of Defense R&D budget, which was a fairly astounding finding given the fact that they were just a small portion of the total technology base. We've also known for many years that a lot of companies, even those who are in the market now with the government, still will not do developmental work with the government because of some of the unique rules and challenges. For those of you who are familiar with or not familiar with OTAs, they actually came into being in the late 50s, believe it or not, with the creation of NASA and a recognition that there was going to have to be a different approach and a different kind of marketplace. They were extended to DoD some 30 years later and extended beyond DoD to other agencies over the last number of years. They were originally intended to be used as an R&D tool, and that's exactly how they were used up until about 4 or 5 years ago. And total spend on OTs up until that point was relatively modest. And Dolores may have more current data, but I believe if my memory serves correct, we were at about, by 2014 or so, 2015, we were still under $1 billion in total OTA spend, probably in the $500 to $700 million range. This immediate past fiscal year, when the data is finally compiled, I think we're going to be up close to $12 billion. Most of that growth has come in the last 3 years, or maybe 4, since Congress changed the rules. After much discussions that started when I was in office at the Pentagon in the 90s, Congress agreed to allow the use of other transactions, not just for R&D, but to take the terms and conditions of an OT agreement all the way through the life of a capability, or if you will, the life of the contract. So in the old days, you would go through an OT, you get to the final stage of development, getting ready to go to production, and everything would fall back under the traditional FAR model. That was very problematic. It caused us to lose a lot of access to talent, and I think limited the use of OTs dramatically. The advent of what's called production authority, this ability to use the terms and conditions for the life of a program, opened the floodgates. Add to that the pandemic, and I want to be really clear about this. I don't know that we have any specific data yet to break it out, but it's very clear that the last 1.5 years or so of spend in OTs has included a sizable chunk of money going towards pandemic relief, particularly the vaccine. In fact, the Army had been doing mRNA research under OTs for 15 years, seeing mRNA as a way to combat anthrax. So there is some of that growth has been tied to the current pandemic, but no matter how you cut it, the growth has been significant. So this has, of course, raised a whole series of questions and a lot of discussion. And the most common question is, well, where do we use them and how do we make sure we only use them when appropriate? But that's, to me, the wrong question. We don't know where they're appropriate or not appropriate until we understand what they actually are. And there's been actually precious little work done around the question of what do the OTs today actually look like? How are they constructed? What are they delivering? There's very little information about that out there. And when we were approached by IBM to see if I'd be interested in pursuing this, it was a no-brainer because we recognized that most of the discussion had been around how much money is going to what kinds of companies and so forth, but very little of it around the real practical details of what do these things look like, what are they delivering or not, and so on. So we took on this challenge, and we wanted to look, as it says on the slide, at four basic questions. Do they achieve their objectives? The goal of OTs, like most acquisition reforms of the last 20 years plus, 25 years, is to open the government's aperture. So are we in fact getting new entrants and capabilities? Are they actual contracts, or is it the Wild West out there? There are a lot of people in the acquisition community who have said to me, OTs make me nervous. All we're going to have to do is have one person screw up and Congress will yank away the authority. That's probably a fair statement, but we have plenty of screw ups in real contracting too. So the real question is, how are they constructed? What are they delivering there? Third, how are they like or unlike traditional FAR-based contracts? And this is probably the most important question. Are there critical components of the FAR, things that we consider essential to the ethos of public procurement that are not present in OTAs? And also importantly, do we have the structure, the culture, and the workforce to do them right? So the answers, as it says here, the bottom line up front was yes, yes, more than one would think, and no. So in other words, what we found, and I'm gonna go through this in a minute, what we found was we don't really have a lot of problems with the vehicles themselves, with the contracts or the agreements themselves. They are actually more like a FAR document than you would think, but we have a lot of work to do on workforce and culture and so on. So let me just quickly run through these facts that, again, a little bit of demystification. OTs are contracts. You will hear a lot of people say they're not contracts, they're agreements. The reason they're called agreements is because, as all of you probably know, in the parlance of federal procurement, if it's not under the FAR, a contract is defined as something covered by under the FAR. So because OTs are exempt from the FAR, people assume they're not actual contracts, but by any other definition, they are. Second, these, contrary to a lot of popular opinion, OTs are not necessarily intended to be a tool to get to small business or even to emerging or cutting edge technology. The focus of OTs is on capability. Are there capabilities out there that we are not getting access to? So to simply measure or talk about OTs in terms of how many startups are involved or what have you is to miss the point. Third, they're not only for R&D for new technology, particularly in the last few years with the advent of production authority. This is really important. They're often being used to take existing technology that's being fielded today in a commercial environment to see if it is applicable and effective in a government mission environment, whether it's national security or whatever it might be. And so we've known for a long time that substantial percentages of the components of major weapon systems or business systems across the government have commercial analogs. The question is, are those commercial analogs further along? Do they deliver capability, and can they operate in a government environment? Next, whether the traditional contractor does the majority of work or not is not a measure of whether OTs are being used appropriately. This is another canard that you hear a lot, that, well, 70% or 80% of the money is going to one of the big four or big five integrators. That is not the issue. The issue is whatever percentage of money that is being funneled through an OT to a new capability, what is the impact of that capability? I'm not a technologist. Many of you have much more technology chops than I do, but it's not at all uncommon in today's marketplace to find a relatively modest application that can fundamentally change the way work is done or fundamentally change the outcomes, the efficiency, the effectiveness. And so let's not worry so much about where is the money going from a prime contracting perspective and look much more at impact, which we, by the way, don't measure, and I'll talk about in a second. Next, OTs are not monolithic. There are several different models or methodologies. There's the consortium method, in which there are pre-established consortia that exist sort of, you can almost think of them like a GWAC. You know, they're set up to, and they have membership, and the members are the only ones who may be able to bid on a given opportunity. There are direct OTs, there's the the commercial services opening that Defense Innovation uses. So there are multiple methodologies, and the way they're actually implemented amongst the different military services can vary significantly as well, which, by the way, is also a problem. And finally, they're not just for weapons technology or even just for DoD. We are seeing more and more OTs used for business systems. There have been other transactions around supply chain and all the different various aspects of supply chain, around financial management systems and distributed ledger. Transcom did one a few years ago around blockchain. So we are seeing folks looking at OTs as a tool to get to applications and capabilities that are positively impacting business processes as much as national security mission. And then the authority exists across multiple agencies, and the number of agencies actually also now have the production authority, although to date, it's really just DoD that has exercised that. So I just want to stop there for a second, ask Dolores to chime in, because there may be some areas I think here where she can provide a little bit more flavor beyond what the sort of the flat out statements I just made. Dolores?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll start with the second bullet in terms of that looking at OTs isn't just looking at organizations that are solely small or emerging tech companies. I think we forget that the definition of a non-traditional government contractor doesn't say small business. We know that small businesses are by default non-traditional government contractors. But one thing to keep in mind is a lot of large businesses are also considered non-traditionals. And it really just lies into what that definition says, and then also based on the capability that they're providing or what kind of contracts the large company is doing. And the reason I bring this up is because for a long time, I was under the assumption too that really just meant small businesses. In my last company that I worked at, it was a large organization, and they fell under the non-traditional based on the CAS part of the definition for non-traditionals. So that is a very important point, that it's about the capability, it's about the type of company that's providing that capability, because we want to increase innovation. And that's really what's the driving force of other transactions, which I want to also highlight the very last bullet, Stan, that you made about OTs aren't just weapons tech or even just DoD use, because the authority was updated specifically to take out just the weapons piece to make sure that it was in support of our warfighters and in support of moving the needle a little bit further for innovation. So all of these are very important when we talk about OTs. And what we're seeing in the recent data as we look at FPDS is that a lot of these OTs are being awarded under the R&D PSCs, and also to help combat COVID, to help solve problems of automating a process and helping the government run more efficiently. So just keeping that in mind as we're looking at, what this report has stated, and also what the new numbers are coming in and also showing the importance of how OTs can be used for many things, as long as we are moving the needle a little bit to the right when it comes to innovation.
Thanks, Dolores. So with that as a foundation, let's talk about what we actually found, because there are some key questions that need to be answered, and because obviously we're talking about the public dollar and protection of the taxpayers' interests. First point I want to make is that OTs are not, in fact, a significant departure from the tenets of public procurement. We looked at, as part of our study, we looked at a set of OT agreements, redacted OT agreements, so we could actually look at the different clauses that were in them. We had them reviewed by government contracts attorneys to try to see what the gaps are, where the holes are in terms of key elements of the FAR or analogs to elements of the FAR that are not there. And they were very few and far between. And I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. But when it comes to the key tenets of public procurement, competition, transparency, and accountability, they line up very well. That should not be a surprise for those of who are as old as I am, and I think maybe Kevin is one of the only people out there who can even claim to be in the ballpark. Back in the 90s, when I was at DoD, we were discussing production authority with the Hill, but before we went to the Hill, we had the team go out and look at OTs back then to see what they looked like, much the same way we did, Jason Knudsen, my co-author, and I did in this paper. And what we found back in the 90s was that OTs looked an awful lot like a FAR Part 12 contract, as FAR Part 12 was written and conceived in the 90s. That is no longer a good measure because FAR Part 12 has been diluted so badly with some 156 clauses and since it was put into place 20 some odd years ago. But the fact that the agreements that we looked at today continue to look a lot like Part 12 as Part 12 was initially conceived. So we don't think, in our view, that there's a huge issue with a departure from public procurement, the tenets of public procurement. The second thing is, and on the negative side, is that despite the advent of production authority and a massive increase in OT spending, it's still largely at the R&D and the R&D phase. We are seeing less success on the transition to production. Some of that is a matter of timing because the production authority hasn't existed that long, but it's very clear, and this we don't have good data on because no one keeps this data, but let me put it this way. We did 4 dozen or so interviews in addition to our literature search and the contract reviews and so forth, to a person who's had any experience at all with OTs. We were told that production contracts are proving exceedingly difficult to get to. And the number one reason, which is really the next bullet in our findings, is the tendency of the government to want to fall back on traditional FAR clauses and can't get out of the FAR mindset. And so even though you're supposed to be able to use the T's and C's in the contract vehicle all the way through the life of a program, at the point of production transition, there is a heavy tendency on the government's part to insert FAR clauses, particularly around intellectual property and tech data rights, less so, but increasingly around CAS. So that traditional FAR mindset is causing the government to fall back on what it knows. And as a result, in most every case that we looked at, the non-traditional contractor is exiting the market at the point of transition and largely either licensing whatever they brought to the table to the prime or to the government for that immediate use case. Now you could argue, say, well, we got access to the technology, that's good. Yes, it is. But the ability to apply the technology is limited because it's for a certain use case, and you lose access to the intellectual and technological capital that created the innovation to begin with. And part of the point here is that longer term relationship. Fourth, our data collection is not very good. There's a lot of data that's out there. There's a lot of data that the consortiums report to DoD and so forth, but it is largely inaccessible. It is not synthesized in a way that you can actually draw a narrative from it. So we need to do a much better job of collecting data, both in terms of spend and outcomes being equally important. And finally, the color of money, this is a DoD issue, and DoD was the focus of our study. The PPBS process and color of money is really a challenge. And this is something DoD is still struggling with. There, as you probably know, there's some pressure from the Hill and back and forth between the department and the Hill as to whether they're going to do a review of the PPBS process. But the idea is, the essence is that you can get money for experimentation and for the R&D phase, but getting money for production, for execution, is much tougher and puts you back in that 3 or 4 year cycle, depending on when you actually can start the cycle. And that, of course, kind of defeats the purpose. Speed to market, speed to value is what drives the technology base. And these transitional dollars are proving hard to get. And so we could have a lot of discussions about how to fence different kinds of money and so forth, but this is a problem that still exists out there. Quickly, on just in interest of time, and then I'm going to ask Dolores to make some more comments. Competition. When you talk about the tenets of public procurement, we're at over 75% competed. The consortiums, as I said, operate somewhat like GWACs, but 75% competition, as GAO is itself said, is pretty impressive. Transparency and accountability, I will not go into great detail here, but happy to answer questions or get into more discussion. They tend to be very transparent and very accountable documents. First of all, they're typically relatively limited in scope. You don't see a lot of OTs. I mean, we've seen some problematic ones over the years, Future Combat System being one, which was an enormous, complex program. Most of the ones you see today are for fairly discrete and definable capabilities. They are typically performance-based. In fact, the CSO process, this commercial services opening process that underpins how DIU does its OTs, it's increasingly being used and looked at by other agencies, including DHS, is almost by definition a performance-based approach. It's basically I'm going to give you a problem statement. I want to know how you'd address it and what your experience has been and what your bona fides are. But once we get past that and I decide that you're legit, I want to see what you can do. And a lot of it is a lot of the outcome, your benefit hinges on the deliverable. OTs are entirely auditable if they're of a certain size, over $5 million. So not very big. They are auditable. The difference is they are not subject to CAS. Personal view, my co-author Jason Knudsen's view and mine, I think Dolores probably agrees with this, is if the rest of the world can operate under generally accepted cost accounting principles, I think the government can probably survive as well. I mentioned earlier the data from the consortia and DIU and so forth about how limited it is. And finally, what we were told by the lawyers was, yes, it's true that there are some FAR and ethics and other related clauses that are not included in OTs. But for most of them, there are commercial analogs that protect the government's interests. Perfectly willing to take another look at that. It's certainly an area we have to protect and make sure we do right. But by and large, the review from the legal experts was not a big gap. In terms of delivering new capability, as you can see right here, 88% of the OTs have some non-traditional participant. The overwhelming majority of the dollars, or according to one consortium management group, which is one of the large consortia, or the overwhelming majority of primes are non-traditionals, according to ATI, which is another large consortia. So we are getting new capability to the space. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know a lot about impact versus dollars. We do have a problem of keeping the non-traditionals in the game beyond the initial R&D phase, both for production and for ongoing development. I don't mean to be flippant here, but what we're really looking for here is a good marriage, not a short-term fling. And then there are significant differences amongst them between the military services, how they use or don't use OTs. This is ever changing. The Army has just recently announced another major OT initiative in some significant areas. We expect Space Command, Space Force will be using a lot of commercial solutions, and they've talked a lot about using OTs and other alternative acquisition tools. In fact, the Defense Authorization Bill, the House version, has a provision requiring them to do that. And then you have the leadership in the department continue to talk about their frustration with the lag in technology and innovation. So I think we may see some more forward movement, but there are still differences of how OTs are implemented, which creates confusion in the system. Before I get to the recommendations, Dolores, let me stop again and ask you to chime in. I apologize, I jumped ahead here. Apologize. So you can talk about some of these points from what you've seen where you sit.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I wrote down 3 points that I just wanted to highlight based on the last few slides. I think the first one is about OT usage and the appearance of FAR clauses. I think the biggest thing, and you and I talked about this last week, we need to use OTs more. And I think that's where the demystifying has to get away from OTs, because they are supposed to be flexible. They're supposed to be more of what you see in the commercial B2B type of contract negotiations, where you have freedom to negotiate, you have freedom to collaborate. And we can take that away if we continuously start flooding it with FAR clauses and staying in the comfort zone of when we're putting the contract together. And one of the things that I think we've all seen as well is when you see all those FAR clauses in an OT solicitation, and on the industry side, I know that's a huge, what I would say, turnoff, as if we're keeping the relationship metaphor going. It's a huge turnoff, and it can be a quick slide over to the left and a no for a lot of industry to say, I don't want to do business with the government if this flexible new way of contracting is going to continue using the same clauses that deter me from working with the government in the beginning. And that's where it's very important for industry to also communicate to the government why they're turning away or what their issues might be, and open up that door of communication so that we don't see that become an issue or a bigger issue when we're looking at OT solicitations. The second piece, I think, is competition. I really wanted to touch on this because from an industry perspective, we want it. Small businesses, emerging tech businesses, large businesses, they want to do OTs because they see the advantage of it. They see that there is a way to customize it for the solution that you're trying to provide to the government. And there's also flexibility in the way that you negotiate data rights and IP rights, which is very important to a lot of organizations like that. I've seen also in my discussions with some of the end users on the government side, that is a contracting pathway that they're very interested in. And the problem there is they just don't know how to talk to the contracts person to get it on contract. So again, I think that pretty much helps echo the volume of like, we need to use it more. If we don't use it enough, you know, it's a privilege that we have it. It's a tool that we can use for us to make us better, and we need to use it more, and we need to not be scared of it. The third part is reporting. I will tell you, with my dissertation experience, reporting is a pain in the butt. There is reports from everywhere. And a lot of times, you know, part of the significant differences on this last bullet on the slide here, each part of the military, the Army, the Navy, Air Force, they also have internal reports that they use when it comes to OTs. And a lot of that has very good information. I only know of what kind of information's on there based on the columns that I have heard about from discussions when I was asking about reporting during my research gathering. But, you know, there are instances where there's reporting that can be done better. And FPDS, even though it's growing in terms of the way that the data is being gathered there, it's also not a complete set of data because you can't see R&D OTs in FPDS. So you don't even have the full picture of what's there. And like you said, Stan, also with consortia and consortia management groups, there's reporting that they're required to do that are not public access for us to really see the impact of OTs and what they're actually able to achieve. So it's really important for us to be able to have visibility to that, have a little bit more transparency in how they're being used so that we can avoid questions like we've seen in some CSR reports saying, are OTs being used properly? How do we know they're effective? Well, the only way we can do that is if we have transparency and if we're able to look into the data and actually be able to dig in and say, yes, they are useful. And how can we make them better is by using this data to help them grow.
Yeah, if I could, I'm just going to foot stomp on one point here before we go to the last portion here. On the question of FAR clauses, just two quick points. One is, I've had a lot of people say to me in the course of doing this research and over the years, having been involved in acquisition reform and technology for a long time, you know, industry shouldn't worry about that clause because it's really not that bad. Or we've structured the FAR in such a way that we do have the flexibility to do what we need to do. The non-traditional industry looks at that and says, that's all well and good, but number one, that's not necessarily how you behave. And number two, we're not necessarily going to take that risk. So it's not just whether the clause itself is problematic or anti-commercial in quotes. It's the mere, for many companies, it's the mere imposition of the FAR that makes them nervous because there's so much that goes with that. And so there's that piece. The second thing is on the specific question of IP and tech data rights. We need to be very clear here. No one is suggesting that the government should not protect its equities. Clearly, where the government has funded R&D, the government has certain IP rights, and we even in those cases have some issues with negotiating the rights for dual use and so forth. The issue is whether the government should have or can expect all of the rights. And it tends to be a zero-sum game in a lot of too many IP discussions. And again, it's important what the policies or the laws say. What's much more important is what the customer perceives to be the reality, because that's what you have to be able to overcome. And that's where the nature and quality of the negotiations and the discussions become so important. So it's not a black and white issue. Some of it has to do with perception, but it's something we have to be very aware of. So a few things that we need to do. One is our belief, Jason's and my belief, is that there ought to be an absolute prohibition on putting FAR clauses in OTs. As I've said several times, there are almost always commercial analogs, and we can protect the taxpayers' equities, the government's equities, without FAR clauses. The very imposition of a FAR clause is going to cause a problem by definition. Second, as Dolores and I both have mentioned, we need much better publicly available data, not only around spend, but on impact at the project level, not just at the meta level. Third, Section 809 panel, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, had a set of recommendations around commercial items in FAR Part 12. Absolutely have to adopt those recommendations. We need to get, there's an old 70s song. One of the lines is, got to get back to the garden. It was about Woodstock, but in this case, we're talking about the FAR. We got to get back to what Part 12 really was meant to be, what it looked like and what it did. It's been allowed to be diluted so much that the new generation of commercial technology companies is not any more interested in doing business with us than the old generation of technology companies were until we changed the FAR back then. And we're going to have some discussions, and Dolores and I kind of went around and around on this, and Jason Knudsen and I went around and around on it when we were writing the report. We're going to have to come to grips with how best to think about OTAs as in terms of our socioeconomic goals. It's going to have to be a conversation if we're going to grow OTs the way we'd like to see them grow, because I think Dolores believes that they present a really viable alternative, but you can't do it in a vacuum. So what does it look like? How would you actually think about socioeconomic impact with regard to OTs so that we're addressing another core premise of the public spend? That is out there, it is a reality, and it's something we have to come to grips with. There are going to be some areas I think we might be able to actually do some unique and creative things through OTs, particularly thinking more about nature of work and location of work than necessarily ownership and so forth. But again, that's a discussion we're going to have. But most of all, we really have a challenge with people. If you take the time to read the report, you'll see that we talk at length in there about some of the efforts that have been made by the Army over the years, Ben McMartin and his teams when he was in the Army, basically on their own time, doing as much training as they could across the Army on OTs. But the reality is we have a tremendous shortfall in OT skills and real challenges with the culture. That's why we end up having so much FAR creep. So we've made a set of recommendations, one of which is to create an independent joint agreements officer workforce. They would, in our view, they don't have to be 1102s, although if that's not going to fly, that's fine. The Navy, by the way, has a internal effort where their agreements officers are not 1102s intentionally, primarily because they want to get people who are not at all burdened by traditional thinking about the FAR. DARPA, which has used a lot of OTs, doesn't do it that way. You have to be an 1102 to be an agreements officer, but you have to demonstrate a special aptitude. Whatever way we get there, we've got to get to some sort of workforce whose job it is to move the needle and push us forward. And that would obviously, without saying, involves a lot of expanded training and across functions, multifunctional training, because the problem can be as much with a finance person or a lawyer or whomever as it is with a contracts person. We also recommend a standard ADR process be implemented. I didn't talk in this briefing about the protest issues and what we've learned about the degree to which OTs are subject to protest. The answer is they are subject to certain kinds of protests, but not others. The courts will take on OT cases if there's some major issue. Doesn't seem to be as big an issue as some have made it out to be. We didn't talk to anybody who wants to see protests become the norm, obviously, with OTs. But some sort of really clear and consistent ADR process is probably the best way to go. As I mentioned, it was 50 years ago that we crossed that Rubicon, and I think our conclusion was report. And Dolores, I'm going to give you the last word here to make some last comments. But I think Dolores and others that she's worked with would say that this is the time really to actually move the process forward. Dolores, you want to make some final comments before we open it to questions?
Yes, absolutely. I will say that in terms of, this report and also what I'm finding with my dissertation research is that now is the great time for us to really put into action all the things that we've been saying we really want to do and be able to help promote innovation, help move that needle, and have the government become more of a promoter of innovation as it was in the past, around the 1950s, the 1960s, versus what we're seeing now where it's mostly fled from the industry side. and have those two needles kind of flip on the map that we're seeing now, where industry is surpassing government promoted R&D, and have government actually be on top of that, so that there is less risk for some of these more innovative, more riskier technologies or processes that are much needed, I think, in the DoD and even beyond in all other agencies. So I agree with you, Stan. I think that we have some work to do. It's not a lot. It just sounds like a lot. It's just a matter of just tweaking a couple of things that we're seeing that need to be adjusted, and then just going from there.
All right, with that, let me close out that screen and open it back up. And Nicole, I don't know how you want to handle questions if people just pop up and raise their hands or what have you.
Yeah,
We're more than willing to take any questions.
I think this is Lisa. I think we aren't manually making people stay muted, so I think they can speak up, but we thought we would start with the question that Kevin left in the chat before he had to hop off. So his question is, fear of loss of IP rights is a barrier to interest by firms bringing innovation. Curious if you've done or seen any work on how much IP the government ends up owning as a pragmatic matter on things it develops even under FAR 15 data rights rules.
So I'm gonna give a careful answer. And Dolores, I don't know how much you've dealt on this, and I'm going to suggest you want to check my honesty with a IP lawyer. I believe that when you're in a FAR 15 environment, and the government is funding the R&D, the government has pretty broad data rights. The government essentially owns them. There have been some efforts where you have dual use technologies where it's not pure, the pure research is less pure, it's more applied research where we run into issues. And that continues to be a challenge, even with the traditional industry and government. And you hear about this all the time. But clearly under FAR 15, where the government is this provider of the R&D dollars, the government has broad data rights. Now, let me throw in a couple of complications. And again, I am not a lawyer. And Dolores, again, I don't know how much you've dealt with this. You're more than willing to chime in here. Where I've seen challenges is where there are technologies in a larger integrated system. So let's say the government is, I'm going to make this up. This is totally notional. You've got the Joint Strike Fighter, which is a DoD program. R&D for Joint Strike Fighter has been a massive investment by the government. The government, quote unquote, owns the tech data rights, but does it own the tech data rights to all of the componentry? Because what components are commercial? What rights do they maintain for their own family jewels, if you will? So it can get really complicated. The fact that it's complicated and challenging, even in a FAR environment, just tells you how challenging it can be where the FAR doesn't apply, and explains why there is a tendency just to throw the FAR clause back in there. So it's a good question. I don't have a very specific answer, but clearly under a FAR Part 15 contract, the government does have more rights than it would under a commercial contract. I don't know, Dolores, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I don't have a very specific answer for Kevin either, but what I will say is there is a lot of interest in looking at the trends of IP rights, especially when it comes to people wanting, or not people, but probably more of companies wanting to hold on to their IP more strategically versus what we've seen in the past when companies were willing to go ahead and patent their efforts or copyright their efforts. And there's a lot of economists that are looking into the trends internationally. There's several research papers, and I can pull them up and send them to Kevin or whoever's interested, that were shared from another conference that I was a part of, that looked at how the numbers of trademarks and patents has decreased since certain policies in the 80s and the 90s were passed when it comes to acquisition. So it'd be interesting to look at those studies as it pertains to various acquisition clauses that have been passed and seeing if they made an impact. And that's what's going on. There are assumptions made of how much the government is holding on to in terms of IP. I think we've all heard from other people where, you know, the question is how much of our IP is collecting dust on the government shelves? The answer to that is question mark. I don't know. I think that there is some use in looking into that and seeing where that IP is being used, but also some of the responsibility, I think, also lies on the industry and the government to understand what they're purchasing and how it will be used, and if the government really needs those IP rights.
Yeah,
So
let me,
it's a bigger
that was,
discussion.
yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to chime. That's the key point actually. Also, is this is not a one-way street. Uh, Even with an emerging purely commercial company selling something to the government that has a national security implication, the idea that the government will have no rights is also not tenable. The government needs to protect its own interests and be able to, if something happens, be able to do what it needs to do. So it is a two-way street. It is a different environment. I think the last thing I'll say on this, Lisa, is the federal acquisition regulation was written for what we call a monopsony market, for a market where the vendors had basically one customer, and that was the government. That is not the real world today. So that requires everybody to think differently. And IP is maybe one of the most central issues in that whole debate discussion.
I really appreciate that, because my follow-on question that I had been thinking about was around, as we are encouraging the government to use as a service offerings and go more of a platform route, how does that affect the use of OTAs or specific IP that's developed then? Because it has to be a two-way street. Exactly.
Yeah, again, it's going to be very procurement specific and what's involved and the sensitivities and so forth. A lot of as a service agreements have all kinds of protections for the buyer in them and what have you. So it's really very specific to the individual case.
Right. And I do want to say, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to either chime in now. You can unmute and chime in, or go ahead and drop them in the chat and we can moderate them forward as well. In the meantime, I was also interested in, to combat the trend that you see in the government's ability to apply IT or access to the IP after the OTA is completed. How do you think we gather data on why companies are doing that? I think it would be difficult, and I immediately went to a very standard exit interview kind of answer, like why are you stopping, and ask both the government and the vendor, why aren't we continuing to mature this past the R&D phase to allow for the acquiring
Yeah.
or the continued maturation in a production environment?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question, and whether it should be done. As I said, we literally didn't talk to an individual who. There's been one or two success stories, if you will, in production, but everybody we talked to cited this as the key issue that the companies were exiting. I actually like your idea, and I might take it one step further. But it's an idea that I'd like to see us apply to acquisition more broadly, if I can. And that is, this is something when I was at PSC we proposed, and DHS was starting to dabble with it, but never really took it on in a big way. And that is, why are we not doing 360 evaluations of procurements when they're done as a general rule? In other words, large procurements, to do a 360 evaluation of all the stakeholders involved, not about the outcome, like who won and all that stuff, but about the process. Was it a good process? Was there collaboration? Were the negotiations good negotiations? Was there equal knowledge on both sides of the table? All those kinds of things that will help, to your point, help us identify and define what's causing the problem with OTs. But I think it also has a broader application to acquisition generally, because I don't think we have a very good grasp on that. I think there are assumptions being made there just as commonly. And maybe since Dolores is writing her dissertation now but hasn't finished, we could just ask her to delay it a couple months and go do this research.
I'm sure she has no other timeline.
Well, she's got just because she has a full-time job, but what the heck?
No, I would actually love to answer that question, but after I finish the dissertation for sure. I think I think this goes back to also having access to look at the information. I believe it was last year, there was an attempt from DoD to try to get feedback in a reporting sense for SAM from DoD contracts information that stated, like, what did you find, was this OT a success? Was it a failure? And like for contracting people to actually be able to fill that in. And I thought that was really interesting from the perspective of there was no definition of success. And that could be, they found out that this R&D effort maybe didn't work, or this prototype didn't work, or their success is that it moved on to production or follow-on efforts in one way or another. but they had no definition of it. And so my academic brain came in and was like, well, we have to define success. We have to define failure. And the other point I wanted to make was when I was doing some research in terms of innovation policy and how we track innovation through acquisitions, I had a very interesting conversation with one professor who told me that there hasn't been any innovation that has come out of DoD or the government because there's nothing that you can trace in a linear path of that, technology or that product. And I thought that was a really interesting way for people to look at it, because I think as more and more of us know about innovation, we know it's not a linear path. It's not something that just like goes from point A to point B. It probably like more spirals out into a network model. So being able to look at technology and being able to measure the success, the impact, and the failures of it, I think would have to be more of a, let's say, like a qualitative study where we look at agreements and see, are there elements of the R&D effort that were maybe taken further in another contract or in another effort versus the entire idea.
Yeah, I think that also gets back to the point I think we talked about earlier, which is a lot of OTs, not all of them, but a lot of them tend to be very discrete requirements. And they fit into sort of an agile mindset, if you will. I mean, they're very consistent with the agile mindset because generally the prototyping process is not a 5-year deal. It's relatively short that you can actually find out, particularly in an applied technology space perspective, relatively soon, is it going to work or not in our environment? The fact that it doesn't work doesn't make the OT a failure. In fact, that's a success because I was able now to definitively define whether this stuff works or not. A failure in an OT perspective is if I go full production and the whole thing crashes, then I could say this was not a successful acquisition. And so to Dolores' point about how we define success, that's the point I was making earlier. Impact is really important. Also recognizing that we can fail fast is a good thing without going too far down the road. So I think there's a number of pieces to this puzzle that bear a whole lot more discussion and research, but it's certainly part of the puzzle. And there's somebody, there's a question, if you talk to the folks over at USDS, we haven't talked to them, I haven't talked to them about OTs. I've talked to folks who are indirectly involved with USDS about OTs. But there is a fairly close alliance between the digital services folks and the innovation and DIU folks at DIU. So there's a lot of joint conversation. But to the point that I was making earlier, I think that the model is an agile model in a strategy perspective, not necessarily. I mean, clearly, it's agile software is the thing to do, but I'm saying in a broader sense, it's an agile model and gives you some good visibility. But as Dolores said in the chat, that'd probably be a really interesting conversation independently. But they're looking more at just accessing digital solutions or creating digital solutions. I think this even goes a whole lot deeper than just the digital solution. It gets into fundamental business processes and fundamental interchanges. I tell you one place where I think OTAs could be really exciting, and I'll just throw this out there. One of the first executive orders of the administration was a directive to look at how we can better use data to improve the performance of our vast plethora of public benefits programs. And you think about how disconnected they are, whether it's food stamps, assisted lunch at schools, Medicaid, TANF, I mean, just go through the whole list, and they are completely siloed. Yet the opportunity, the potential for driving massively improved service to beneficiaries and also saving the taxpayer sizable money is clearly there. What a perfect place for OTs and for folks with a really good digital mindset.
It's a fabulous last comment, I think. I do want to check and make sure, is there anything else, Dolores, that you want to bring up or cap the meeting with?
I would just say, I think probably having just the conversation still open and being able to use that conversation to help create the change. I know that through my efforts of putting the research together and then also talking to people like Stan that want to move the needle as I keep saying, there's a big need for it. And so by having the conversation going and taking on some action items to help create the change, I think that's the important part. And we need to stop thinking of OTs as something that we need to demystify. They have been around. It's a purpose of us using it and implementing it and then measuring. And I think that's the important key takeaway for me from reading the study, from working with Stan over the last year or so. Is that, it's really just about us putting it into action and being able to put the pieces together and make it work.
Well, I do want to say thank you again to both Stan and Dolores for this really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. You can find the link to the IBM Center paper on our ACT-IAC page for this event, and we will be posting the recording there as well and these slides. And I think Dolores has put her LinkedIn. I'm sure you can find a way also to get in touch with them, or you can come through the acquisition working group if needed. So thank you again for this really interesting presentation. It's very different than what we had talked about previously on OTs, because there are some real good actionable recommendations to move forward, and speaking not just for OTs, but also as in a larger acquisition workforce.